broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor. It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. This hour, public health researchers want to make social interaction a prescription, and they need to get the entire health system on board. We will discuss how they plan to do that. And later, a world-renowned mariachi band is coming to town. We will discuss the music's history and importance today. Let's turn to the subject of loneliness and isolation. Former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy calls it an epidemic, and it's a problem that only seems to be getting worse. Around 40% of Americans ages 45 and up report being lonely. This puts them at higher risk for all kinds of serious health concerns like dementia and stroke. Now, some public health researchers are turning to a new kind of prescription to address the problem, a practice called social prescribing. Why is loneliness so common? Why is it difficult for people to overcome? And how can the healthcare system address loneliness instead of its negative consequences? Joining me now to help answer those questions is Dr. Mary Henningfield. She's the executive director of the Wisconsin Research and Education Network at the University of Wisconsin. She's leading an effort to make conversations about loneliness a regular part of medicine in the United States. Dr. Henningfield, welcome to the Metro.
Great to hear you. Thanks for having me. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important topic.
Absolutely. And we also are taking your calls. What do you do to stay connected with the people in your life? What keeps you from socializing the way you'd like to? The phone lines are open. The number, of course, is 313-577-1019. Okay, Dr. Henningfield, I want to start with the state of loneliness today. Give us kind of a gist of where we are now. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you said in your introduction, about 40% of Americans experience loneliness, and that's a very high number. And I think it's interesting because a lot of people sort of think about loneliness and social isolation increasing because of the pandemic, and certainly that
Mm-hmm.
happened. But even before then, there was a trend of increases in both loneliness and social isolation,
Mm-hmm.
and that was because a lot of the sort of social structure of the US was changing, over time. People were less likely to, join groups or clubs or, be involved in civic engagement, involved in their community. And also sometimes, online presence, using more social media or like having
Mm-hmm.
those online, internet connections being there. Social life, if you will, versus having the in-person connection. So I think really it's about the same, still at about the 40% rate, but it doesn't seem like it's getting better.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on there a few of the causes, a few of the sources of our growing loneliness circumstances. Can you kind of draw that out a little bit more? You mentioned technology, which I'm sure is one of the symptoms that I think we point to immediately when we think about being isolated, whether we're on our phone, whether we're online, and we're not interacting with people face to face. But you also talked about people gathering and being in social interaction, whether it be advocating for certain things and being in community. Just talk about how those things kind of manifested and how they're causing this.
Yeah. So I'll talk first a little bit about, the internet and social media.
Yeah.
And I will say that in a way it can be a double-edged sword for some people because we also we work with a lot of folks and focus groups and communities because we wanted to hear from them. And sometimes older adults were saying that learning how to use the internet, enabled them to have like Zoom conversations
Right.
with family members like on a routine basis. So there is, a value to that. So they can be, connected and see people that are far away, not in close proximity. So there is that benefit, but it is more, people choosing to be online or looking at videos or sort of absorbing content instead of like building the relationships, especially in-person relationships is the problem. And also like within our just society as a whole, like looking back over the decades, there are less opportunities, and less engagement in certain clubs, and even I think churches is kind of on the upswing a little bit, which is good. But people stopped going to church as much. They weren't involved in community events or clubs, or, like really expressing their interests and like working with others. So I think over the decades that has been happening and is still happening. And it's harder to get out and about and meet people, right?
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. Now, I want to know about the impacts now of loneliness and being isolated. What does it do to the body, like physically?
Yeah, yeah. And as you mentioned at the beginning, the Surgeon General's report was a great resource compiling a lot of the data and the work that has been done about the impact. And I think at that time of the release of that report, there was an interesting comment that the mortality impact of loneliness, of chronic loneliness, that is the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Hmm.
And I think that was like, an impactful statement because, um, it was sort of a mortality difference of 26%. So that's sort of huge. But as you mentioned, many of the systems of the body are affected. Cardiovascular disease, depression is closely linked. So it's not only mental health but physical health, and then cognitive decline or an increase in dementia in people that are chronically lonely. And I think the main theory right now is that long-term loneliness, it triggers sort of a chronic stress
Mm.
response. And so increase in cortisol, there's sort of this long-term inflammation that affects the vascular system. So really any system of the body could be affected. So it's really, really a challenge that, as I said, affects both the quality of your life and really the length of your life.
That's interesting. You said that it impacts our stress, and when I think of loneliness or being alone, as someone who considers himself an introvert, I think of quiet time or alone time as a way to decompress. And it's interesting that you say that I guess a prolonged version of that can cause the opposite effect.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, as you said, like, maybe it's important to maybe take a step back and
Sure.
define loneliness, because it's really the person themselves, their perceptions of whether or not they're lonely
Mm.
and whether they're having the social connections they want to connect. And I think we all want alone time or downtime, and that can actually be, helpful mentally for us. But it's for people who really want to have more social connections. They're lacking, the social connectiveness or sense of belonging that they need in their life. So that's really the definition of being lonely. And I think we've all heard the saying, you can be in a room full of people and still feel very lonely. So that's more of what we're talking about versus a choice to maybe take time to decompress and be alone in that and have that quiet time.
That's an interesting distinction to make. The fact that people are in a state where they're feeling like they're not getting the connections that they need. That's helpful.
Mhm.
I do wonder if people are even decompressing anymore. I mean, a lot of people are simply scrolling on their phones instead of actually letting themselves really decompress.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good point. And also, because we're, people that are doing a lot of scrolling, they're sort of absorbing content and maybe not contributing to content, or doing things that are, like I mentioned at the beginning, a Zoom call with with a family member where you're interacting and kind of making those social connections. So yes, I agree. So people call it mindless scrolling, right? So,
Hmm.
yeah, I think that's a good definition of it.
Hmm. You're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. I'm joined by Dr. Mary Henningfield. She's the executive director of the Wisconsin Research and Education Network at the University of Wisconsin. We're talking about a new approach to America's loneliness epidemic, which is social prescribing. We're also taking your calls. What do you say? What do you do to stay connected? And what keeps you maybe from socializing the way you'd like to? Let us know. The phone lines are open 313 577 1019. So, Dr. Henningfield, we have to get to it. Social prescribing. What is it?
Yes, yes. Social prescribing, one of my favorite topics. And I should also mention that there are other names for social prescribing, but it's also called social navigation,
Hmm.
which maybe describes better, what it is. But it's really when someone who is experiencing loneliness, they are connected to a navigator, and the navigator can be, a social worker or a community health worker, or, someone, a layperson who's trained in social prescribing. And that person helps, they talk to them. It's almost an interview, and they have a conversation to help them better understand the person's needs, what their interests are, Do they, what's preventing them from being more social? And it
Hmm.
could be logistical things too, like transportation and so forth. And so it's really that person helps make the connections to resources within the community to help get people more engaged and become more socially connected. And I will add that for our projects, when we think about social prescribing, we are working through, primary care clinics. That's our project. So we are working through doctors' offices,
Hmm.
but we also really believe in what we call the warm handoff. And what I mean by that is the social navigator helps the person make the connections, but it's maybe being on a call with three people with someone from the organization that is offering an activity, the person themselves and the navigator to kind of make that warm handoff. Because I think what doesn't work is, and it might work for some people, but handing someone a list of activities like, oh, here's some things going on in your community
Hmm.
that you might be interested in. It doesn't necessarily work. So
Right.
maybe you need to do things like, do they need a ride to the event? A lot of people tell us, I'm interested in, whatever topic. Maybe it's an exercise class or, an art show or something, but they don't have anyone to go with. So it's really helping them do that warm handoff and finding what the person needs to actually make it to the event versus giving someone a list of activities that they could look up on their own.
It sounds sort of like you all get a survey of people who are struggling with loneliness to better understand what they're interested in. And then based off of all the things they're interested in, maybe it's gaming, maybe it's, I don't know, sports, recreational sports, maybe it's trivia. And then you find ways to get them connected with people, get them the transportation they need, all of the resources to connect them, almost kind of
Yes.
like a social services kind of thing. Is that?
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
that's
That's
interesting.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting because I feel like people often know that things happen, but still can't actually go. And that you hit on an interesting point there. It's like you can tell them that it's happening. That doesn't mean they'll actually do it.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And it's also, I think, if someone is experiencing loneliness and maybe has been lonely for a while,
Hmm.
it's really hard to make that first step to
Hmm.
get out there and, and show up. So sometimes, like, um, having a ride for someone or having someone pick them up or, just even the introduction so that they know when they get to the activity, there's at least one person they know, right? So that they can talk to, and then that person will hopefully help them make the connections to other people. So yeah, it's getting out the door. It's sometimes a really challenging.
Yeah, I want to hear from our listeners out there who are listening to this conversation. 313-577-1019 is the number. Let us know how you stay connected. We're talking about a lot of activities that are going on in our communities and how likely we are to actually engage with those activities, what's keeping us from them, and what encourages you to go. Let us know. Again, 313-577-1019 is the number. Okay, so Dr. Henningfield, I want to ask a little bit about what we already or what is already being done with healthcare workers. How much of this happens already in the system, and how much more are you all trying to add to it?
Yeah, yeah. I think within systems, within healthcare systems, but also within communities, I think it really varies, by communities and the resources they have. Here in Wisconsin,
Makes
the
sense.
Department of Health Services, they actually have a group that focuses on loneliness and social isolation. So they're doing a lot within the community. And I think what we're trying to do is do more within primary care, and that's not necessarily a place right now where there's a lot going on. Although sometimes people are referred to like a behavioral health specialist, or someone within the healthcare system to help them with loneliness. But it's definitely not standard of care or standard of practice. And sometimes clinicians will say, or doctors will say, well, you know, or they'll ask their patient about whether they're lonely,
Hmm.
but then they feel like they don't have anywhere to send them. They know that they're lonely, they know that they need help, but they don't know what to do. And that's where our project, one of our projects that's starting is project is really to look at using a screener. It's called the UCLA 3-item loneliness scale. So people answer three simple questions, and the questions don't ask like, "Are you lonely?" Because that what we've been told by a number of focus groups. I don't want my doctor just coming up to me and asking me if I'm lonely. So there's three questions, and then that helps give a idea of whether or not this person might be lonely. But then our next project will be the actual social prescribing, like working with, the primary care clinicians, doctors, and helping them, connect with the social navigator to get them out in the community based on their specific needs.
Okay. So there are some roles that I want to define, but we're gonna have to take a quick break first before
Okay,
we get to those.
great.
So when we come back from the break, we'll continue this conversation with Dr. Mary Henningfield. We're going to go inside the doctor's office to dig into how social prescribing can get into the primary care setting. Also, we're taking your calls. Join the conversation right now. Let us know, what do you do to stay connected? What keeps you from socializing the way that you'd like? 313-577-1019. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Metro. I'm Kerry Jr. II. We're talking about America's loneliness epidemic. A recent AARP study found that 40% of U.S. adults report being lonely, and that comes with negative effects on physical and mental health. And a new practice called social prescribing is trying to help. My guest is Dr. Mary Henningfield. She's the executive director of the Wisconsin Research and Education Network at the University of Wisconsin, and she's leading an effort at the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health that has developed a toolkit for doctors to use on this practice. Now, before I come to you, Dr. Henningfield, I want to go to a caller we have. It's Fred in Milford called in and has something to say. Fred, what's on your mind?
Hey, great program. Thank you for Dr. Hemmingfield's appearance today. Here's what's on my mind. I'm a child of greatest generation parents. I've been around a long time. So I grew up with the expectation that the first order of business was not to have social interaction, but the first order of business was to realize you're going to have a lifelong conversation with yourself. So try to develop an expectation or a mindset that you're going to really be alone much of the time trying to figure out life and figure out what to do next. And it became something I enjoyed. Like you talk about decompressing. I talk about, give me some time alone. It's good. The second point I would like her advice on maybe is those who are alone, those who do not have others in their life, those who struggle with that, many, many times find that time useful to develop a talent like Jerry Lee Lewis did. The great singer of my time, piano player, boogie woogie guy from Faraday, Louisiana. He used all that time to become one of the great boogie woogie pianists of the American culture. And then the last thing I'll just add for her opinion is I understand romantic partners. Your expectations and artistic outlets aside, romantic partners, which we all would desire to have in our life to complete us, that's another story, and that's a loneliness, I think, story of an in itself. So, Dr. Hemmingfield, if she could give me her suggestions on that, or whether the agreements or disagreements, I'd appreciate it. I think your listeners would also.
Well, thank you so much for that call, Fred, out of Milford. Really appreciate that call. Dr. Hemmingfield, what do you think of Fred's advice there? Just develop some hobbies, a little bit of self-talk. How is that? Can it help?
Yes, yes. No, thank you for the question and thank you for your comments. Those are great. Yes, I do think that, developing, resilience and I think that has like coming back to the definition of loneliness, it's like what are the social connections that you need that, are missing from, your life. So if you are alone and you like your downtime, that's great and you have hobbies and, you're not feeling lonely, that's great. But for some people, it's really hard for them to be alone, or they're just feeling they're not having enough social connections and they want more. So that's the type of loneliness we're talking about. And I do like the comment about having alone time or downtime. And then being more productive because like sometimes people have also said like boredom is the reason for new inventions, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you have time and you like explore new things. So I can see that point as well. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Fred, for your call. If you're interested in weighing in on this conversation, call 313-577-1019. And let us know. What are you thinking? How do you stay connected? What keeps you from socializing the way you like to? Okay, so Dr. Henningfield, you mentioned in the last segment community workers who can help in some way. Who are they? How can people find one? And is this something that's actually accessible outside of the system that you're trying to build?
Yeah, and that's such a great question because again, it really varies by community and sort of the resources of your community. So, some persons that are called community health workers, they might be employed by your state's Department of Health, and so sometimes those folks are available through you know. Organizations that help people with aging. So a lot of our work is with older adults. So those kinds of resources that are available for older folks.
Hmm.
But it's really variable, and like you said, like not everyone has access to it. I know we work with a lot of rural communities, and like even behavioral health specialists or social workers. Are in high demand because there's just not enough of those people to help. And so that's what I think in the future, like we're sort of also looking at. There are models where other community members are trained to be social navigators, if you will. So it's really laypersons, and also like there's ideas of working with existing programs. And I think a great example that came up in one of our focus groups was Meals on Wheels,
Hmm.
and so the person was delivering meals to the people on their route, and they noticed some people seemed lonely or were more lonely than others, and so they changed their route to like have time to talk to the person, and then eventually or maybe even from the beginning, the conversation and the time they spent with the person became more important than the meal itself. So all of those things of can we use
Mm.
what's already available to try to address loneliness and social isolation, and can we train other people to help us overcome this shortage of community health workers.
That's interesting that you mentioned the kind of accessory interactions that happen while people are
Hmm.
doing other or receiving other services, aiding in this way too. You also mentioned something else that was interesting was you mentioned rural communities and how their access can be different for those residents. Can you also speak to some of the other structural barriers there? Because I imagine there's always obviously transportation is always going to be one that weighs into this, whether people can actually go to the places they want to go to engage with the people they want to speak to. But what other structural things apply here?
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on the community. So I was born and raised in Wisconsin in a in a rural community, and I felt like when I was growing up, there were 4-H, there was bowling leagues, card clubs, like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
activities. So sometimes there's rural communities where people don't necessarily feel lonely because everybody knows everybody else, and there's always a lot of activities. But sometimes in smaller communities, like they're just under resourced, right? Like
Yeah.
the maybe with changing population, their populations are smaller. So there's less, fewer businesses, fewer, things like, bowling or, gyms or places where people can work out or be active. So I think it's really the resources within the community that makes the most difference there.
This reminds me of a time when I was a lot younger. My grandmother in Mississippi, she always hosted on like the weekends. I can't remember which day, whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but she hosted like bingo for the senior citizens in her community. And so we would go with her, and I would always think I was probably 9 or 10 at the time, like a kid. I was like, I don't want to play bingo, grandma. Like, what is this for? Like, I want to go to the park. I want to go to the, amusement park or Disney World or something. And I didn't recognize at the time the value that her hosting this bingo did, probably for her, but also for the residents in the community who went to attend. It's not just playing bingo. You get to talk to people, you get to tell them about your week, your day, what you read that day. Like I hadn't considered all the other things accessory to just the bingo game itself.
Yes, no, exactly. And like bingo's a great example, yeah, because we've also, have worked on community outreach, like, in other projects, like, for cancer screening, because not everyone is seeing their doctor on a regular basis, so there's a population out there that we want to reach. So it's really getting in the community, so things like, bingo, we went to meat raffles, we go to like basketball games, like high school basketball games. But it's also, sometimes people that are lonely aren't even going to those kinds of activities. So it's important to think about what activities or what things they do need to go to. Like, for example, having a table at a grocery store, just like people selling Girl Scout cookies, we're
Hmm.
out there within the communities trying to reach them and tell them about activities or like services within their community that they can join. So, yeah, I love the bingo example. And it's fun, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. the second. I'm joined by Dr. Mary Henningfield. She's the executive director of the Wisconsin Research and Education Network at the University of Wisconsin. We are talking about a new approach to America's loneliness epidemic called social prescribing. The phone lines are still open, folks. If you want to join the conversation, call 313-577-1019. What do you do to stay connected? What keeps you from socializing the way you'd like? Let us know. We want to hear your thoughts. This conversation, Dr. Henningfield, has me reflecting a lot on some of the decisions I make when I'm out. And one thing I also do is headphones in ears, grocery shopping, walking around anywhere. And I'm not the only one. I'm sure I see a lot of AirPods in people's ears. And it's a way for us to kind of disconnect from the community that's around us. I suspect this might be something else that would not be helpful for us in our loneliness if we're already spending time alone on our own. And then when we go out in public, we're also isolating ourselves with our music or podcasts or whatever it might be.
Right, right. Yeah, so I think definitely that can contribute because we're not interacting with the people around us. And I think many of us maybe have gone to a restaurant or some public place where you look at the table across the way and maybe there's a family of four and each of the folks at the table is scrolling on their um, phone and not interacting or not talking to each other. So I think those are the habits or types of things that are concerning in terms of, people not making the connections or, simple things like you mentioned, talking about your day,
Mm-hmm.
telling a joke or saying like what happened, just what happened to you or even how you're feeling. So that's really important to, think about when you are out and about what connections you can make through those daily activities.
What are some signs and symptoms to look out for ourselves or for people we know that tell you that loneliness is a problem to bring up with a doctor?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great question, and maybe I will also like think about the questions that are on the 3-item loneliness scale, which is like,
Hmm.
like how are you feeling? Like, do you feel that you're lacking companionship? Do you feel left out? Do you feel like you're spending too much time alone when you'd rather be interacting with people? And another question is, do you feel isolated from others? And that's really sort of the question of, are you feeling, do you have someone that's really close to you? And I know the other caller mentioned a romantic partner, that you can, tell them your feelings and talk to them about your day. So it's really like, what are you missing? And I feel
Hmm.
like it's really hard to pinpoint symptoms because there's not any one symptom and it would be different for different people. But I know like things like depression is closely linked to loneliness if you're starting to feel that, or, but sometimes there's also like situational loneliness. If
Hmm.
someone in your life has died and you're, just feeling their loss, that happens as well.
Hmm. Oh, wow. Wow. And then another factor is being able to acknowledge it once you feel it, right? How do shame and stigma factor into this isolation?
Yes, yeah. I actually feel like shame and stigma come into it quite a bit. And
Hmm.
when we talk to community members about, how would you feel if your doctor asked you these questions that, would help us screen for loneliness? And we had a lot of very candid feedback. Couple people said they would lie. They would lie to their doctor and not answer correctly, but realistically, because they were worried that, is loneliness now? Oh, is it a mental disease? I don't want to be told I have a mental disease.
Hmm.
And even if I am lonely, what am I going to do about it? Like what can help me? But just really there is a stigma. They don't want to be shamed or just being stigmatized or, put in a bucket that this person is lonely. So we had some really important conversations about that. So it's something we're mindful about as we move forward with our projects.
Yeah, yeah. Your project itself, I'm curious to know what you all hope to gain or achieve with this pilot study because it's still something you're trying to determine whether or not it actually will work for people. Am I right?
Yes, yes, yeah, actually, yes, for sure. So there's actually sort of 2 parts to it. So well, actually sort of 3 parts, but the first part is finished because that was our toolkit that's online, so anyone can take a look at that. But we felt like we needed to educate, doctors about loneliness. So, like, if someone goes to their doctor and there's your medical chart will say like, "Oh, these are your main," we call it the problem list, but it's called different things in different, systems, but, "Oh, how's your diabetes or how's your blood pressure?" But even though loneliness is known to cause the other effects, no one asked about your loneliness during your doctor visit normally, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so it was like educating people about like these are the concerns with loneliness. But the second part is really figuring out like how do we screen for loneliness in busy primary care clinics, and that's really just implementation. Like, is it you hand someone a card with the 3 questions, or do we put it on an iPad, or maybe we send them an email before their visit with the 3 questions. So just working with clinics to figure out ways that are easy to get the answers. And then the third project is actually the social prescribing project,
Right.
where we'll look to see who might screen as being lonely, and then working with the social navigators to see if see if we can make a difference. And there'll be like surveys, and there are other instruments to help judge if people are lonely. And like we'll also do some things to screen for depression and anxiety as part of our overall program.
I imagine too, in the long term, when it comes to implementation, there's a lot of negotiating and collaborating you'll have to do with systems to get people the services they need. Different groups, different organizations, I imagine, all play into this.
Yes, yes, quite a variety, and that's where we've already started working with different community organizations, and again, many of them we're mainly working in Dane County, Wisconsin, which is the Madison area, and many of them do focus on services for older adults, and so we've had some really fruitful conversations with them. They're very interested in this topic. They know quite a few of the people they serve are lonely and want to know what they can do to help. So they have open arms in terms of our project and being and wanting to help. And they have a lot of resources that are out there and maybe are underutilized. So that's something we hope to tap into as well.
And I know we got to wrap up here soon. So I want to know really quickly, what about the people who don't go to the doctor regularly? You are planning to kind of connect with folks who are already going to the doctor, seeing about their health and getting screened and getting surveyed. People who don't go, people who maybe don't have medical coverage, that kind of double whammy effect. They also
Yeah.
need to know too. How do you plan to account for them?
Yes, yes, and that's a huge question. And as I mentioned before, like with our outreach efforts, so that's sort of beyond the first social prescribing study. But yes, as you mentioned, we need to get out in the community. Like that would be our way to do the outreach. And as I said, like grocery stores or places where people need to go and need to be out, and try to reach them that way. But you're right, people are busy. They're working. They're raising their families. They may not have any major health issues, so they're not seeing their doctor regularly. But those are people that it's important for us to reach them as well.
Awesome. Dr. Mary Henningfield is the executive director of the Wisconsin Research and Education Network at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Henningfield, thank you so much for breaking down social prescribing here on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, and I really enjoy discussing this topic. So thank you for having me.
Coming up, the music that brought Mexico together. The world's largest recognizable mariachi band makes its way to Detroit. We'll talk about it next.